arrived at the content of this talk through my work with abuse victims in cultic groups. Although the term cult is defined in different ways by different people, in my work I've found it useful to focus on cultic dynamics rather than cults per se. The cultic dynamic is characterized by a fervently held ideology and an entitled, often charismatic leadership that seeks to induce others to not only comply with demands issuing from that ideology, but to wholeheartedly embrace the ideology. Whereas an authoritarian dynamic enforces compliance, a cultic dynamic enforces compliance and conversion. The cultic dynamic then may be viewed as a special case of an authoritarian dynamic. According to this view, Orwell's 1984 described the cultic dynamic in the interrogation and indoctrination of the protagonist, Winston Smith. The authorities could easily have disposed of Smith with a bullet in the head, but instead, they exerted great effort to change him at a fundamental level, to convert him to the ideology against which he had rebelled. Thus, the book ends with the famous conversion statement, "I love Big Brother." Winston Smith was converted in 1984 after much pain and abuse. So the question arises, what's the connection between abuse and cultic or authoritarian dynamics? I think we can answer that question by first considering the distinction between treating people as objects or subjects. And now I'll go to my slideshow, which you can't see. When we treat other people as subjects, is it working now? That one's working. All right, I'll go here. When we treat, can you hear me? So I don't have to shout, good. When we treat other persons as subjects with goals, desires, needs, beliefs, faults, virtues that may differ from our own, and we present them with an attitude of goodwill in which we wish them well even when we disapprove, and we do not try to limit or impede their freedom even when they make what we see as bad choices, we're respecting them. And I think the essence of respect is treating other people as subjects. They have autonomy and they have an identity that belongs to them, and it is not my right to change them without their permission, explicit permission. When we treat people as objects, we attempt to limit their freedom, to influence or control them, so that they advance our goals, needs, desires, or what we think is right. The level of abuse when we treat people as objects may be very minor, what you could call the ordinary sins of interpersonal living, to severe, such as may occur in child abuse, or situations such as the abuses that occurred in the Abu Ghraib prison during the Iraq War. And there are techniques that may be used to influence what you could call person-objects. And I think in a cultic dynamic, people become person-objects to the influencer, to the leadership of the group. You may use reasoning. You're more likely to use sophistry, which is reasoning that appears on the surface to be true, but really is false. You may just lie. Lies can be very useful to a manipulator. You may use sweet talk. Conformity tendencies. People will comply with a lot of demands just through the natural impulse to conform to whatever a group is doing. We may use intimidation, guilt induction, threats. The techniques are secondary, really, to the goal. The goal is to get a person to do my bidding. And if I am clever and flexible and focused on my goal, I will figure out whatever techniques work with this particular person. And different techniques may work with different people. Now, certain situations increase the risk of abuse, and those situations are characterized by an imbalance of power, where you have one person who has greater power than another one. The prototypical situation is parent-child. And it is no surprise then that child abuse statistics are sometimes kind of alarmingly high. Most parents are respectful toward their children, they love their children, they treat them as beings outside of themselves, but some parents don't. The power imbalance then produces a risk of abuse. It doesn't produce a certainty of abuse, but it does produce a risk. You also have that power imbalance in the teacher-student relationship. I once did a little quick internet searching on that subject, and I was astounded at the percentages of graduate student advisors accused of sexual harassment of female graduate students. The advisor has power. The graduate student is devoted 4 or 5 years trying to get a PhD. She's at the dissertation level, and an unscrupulous advisor, or an advisor who's very adept at deceiving himself, can take advantage of that situation of power imbalance to exploit the young woman. Therapist-client is another situation where you have a power imbalance. There are various studies that have been done of therapists who have had sex with clients, which in theory is against the ethics of the mental health professions. In one study that I recall, about 10% of psychiatrists acknowledged to having had sex with clients, which just surprised me. Even though I'm in the mental health field, I didn't realize it was that bad. Also, closer to the subject of these talks, in religion, you have pastor and congregant, a guru and devotee. You have a power imbalance, and you will have a risk of abuse. I come at the issue of abuse in religious groups from the standpoint of subject, object, and power imbalance to underline the fact that the abuse is not a function of the belief system. It may indirectly be related to the belief system, but I think most of the time the belief system is used as a tool, and the abuser will take advantage of whatever tools are available to him. So it doesn't matter if you believe in Jesus or Buddha or the angel Moroni. What matters is how you relate to other people. Religions are particularly at risk because society tends to esteem clergy and other religious professionals. Also, religious professionals aren't subject to the same level of legal restraint as other professionals. So, for instance, a mental health professional can be licensed in various states or other countries as well. Those licensing boards can become sources that people can appeal to if they have a complaint. Such things exist within some denominations, but not within all. And they're particularly lacking in new religious movements, such as ISKCON was 50 years ago. As I will state later, and as Anuttama will elaborate, it's incumbent upon the religious organizations to develop accountability mechanisms. Also, religious professionals who attempted to abuse people under them can take advantage of the transcendental belief claims. When God says you should do something, it carries more weight than when your sister says so. And a religious abuser can really exploit those who are under him by taking advantage of their faith in the religious belief system. There are many examples of religious abuse within the cultic arena. There are thousands of groups. The Children of God was infamous when its leader, Moses David Berg, was alive for flirty fishing and hookers for Christ. The Legion of Christ within the Catholic Church was a cultic dynamic within a mainstream religion, founded by a man who was a very clever manipulator, who molested young boys of 12, 13 years old who were in his care, who had a secret vow that the seminarians would take not to criticize him or the Legion, and who hoodwinked the Catholic authorities for decades before finally Pope Benedict put him out to pasture and acknowledged that what the initially young men who became old men in the process had been saying about Marcial for decades. ISKCON has had its share of problems, which Anuttama will go into, such as the child abuse in the Gurukulas. Now, a new religious movement is not cast in stone. It can change. And one of the reasons why our organization has engaged in dialogue is because we can do more good by helping a new religious movement change than we can just by criticizing them year after year after year. Not to say that criticism doesn't have some value, but it can also be helpful to try to help people with good intentions to help change their organizations. Let's see, we have till 5. Let me try to. Okay, how can a person with power reduce the risk of abusing others? I'd say, number one, know thyself. Understand how rationalization is the tool of self-deception, and listen to people who are under you. For example, I may believe that my mission has world importance, very vital to the future of humanity. And in so doing, I treat you like a serf. The end justifies the means. My glorious end justifies the means of mistreating you. And I may delude myself, deceive myself into thinking that I'm a righteous person because I chant to myself, my work is vital, God wants us to do this, God has called you to this work, and if you disobey God, He will be disappointed in you. So I'll put the onus on you that you're to blame because you're miserable and you don't get any sleep, and I've taken all your money from you in order to maintain my vanity that I am an important person doing important work. If I question myself, if I look for the defects in myself, and I listen to the complaints perhaps of the people who are under me, I might have a chance of preventing myself from continuing in an abusive relationship. How can people outside a system assess the risk of abuse? Some of the key things that I tell people to look for is, how is dissent handled? In a system that treats people as subjects rather than objects, dissent is respected. Just because you disagree with me doesn't mean that I'm going to pretend that I agree with you. I may disagree with you, but we can disagree and respect each other at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive. Second thing is, a boundaries open. In a cultic kind of system, the boundaries are closed. It's difficult for people to get out. There's all kinds of terrible predictions that are made if they leave the system. In a religion that is not abusive, people leave and people come in. They're free to come and go as they wish. Individuality and autonomy respected. Are our members expected to converge toward a common identity? There's some research that I don't have time to go into that suggests that in a cultic environment, there's a tendency for the members to converge toward the identity of the leader. And in one group, when this was pointed out to the group, their rationalization was just very clever. Well, that was Jesus's personality type, and we're all converging to that. The leader has Jesus's personality type. I often say if my work in this field has taught me anything, it's that the human capacity for rationalization is infinite. And then does the system, do the people in the system, particularly the leaders, acknowledge deficiencies? Or do they deny them or rationalize them? My favorite is when you ask someone, what is some of his defects? And he says, my greatest defect is that I care too much. You know, it's a kind of phony acknowledgement of defect. You know, my defect is that I'm too good. And when you see that kind of thing, it ought to be an alarm bell that maybe there's something wrong with the system. What can religious organizations do to reduce the risk of abuse? And Anuttama will go into this in some detail because he has been doing a lot of it. Educate those with power over others. And they need psychological education, not a cognitive, because we're really talking about a psychological process of self-deception. With the exception, there are people who are psychopaths. They're not deceiving themselves. They know precisely what they're doing when they exploit and abuse other people. But many people in positions of power begin with good intentions. They become intoxicated by that power, and they, as the old saying goes, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Teach members of the organization how to recognize abuse and the factors that cause a risk of abuse, and very important, establish accountability mechanisms to deal with the abuse that will occur even in the best of organizations. Remember what I said, when you have that power imbalance, you have a situation where there is a risk of abuse. The probability of abuse may vary from group to group, situation to situation, but it's always a positive number, which means there will always be abuse. No organization is immune, and if the leadership really intends to limit abuse, they'll expect it to happen, not pretend that they are so noble and so good and so virtuous that it couldn't possibly happen to us. Thank you, and I will turn it over to
For those of you that weren't sure if a Mac is better than a PC, we have a definitive answer because my Mac hooked up with the system and Michael's PC didn't.
It's not PC. It's a Chromebook.
So, we're running a little late because they split the session, so we had to kind of reorganize the room to get started. But hopefully we have time for a few minutes for questions at the end. So, my name is Anuttama. I'm the Dasa. I'm the Communications Director for ICSA, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. And I'll explain a little bit in my presentation. We started opening some channels for discussion and dialogue with what was then called the American Family Foundation around 1996.
98, I think, Minnesota.
Minnesota was the first, but before 96, 98.
97, whatever.
And so I was thinking this panel may be unique compared to so many others going on because it's largely religious communities and spiritual communities talking about the good we can do and maybe analyzing a lot of the negative things in the world. But here we're talking about let's be a little cautious because in our efforts to make the world a better place, sometimes we ourselves become the source of the problem. So that's kind of the spirit of what we want to present here. So, you know, why this panel? For our tradition, the Isha Upanishad, Eastern Vedic tradition, there's one of the verses says we should cultivate knowledge of transcendence or spirit and nescience or matter at the same time, and not just think let's focus on the spirituality of what's going on with other issues that happen in the world as well. I mean, of course, we know the old adage that those that don't study history are destined to repeat it, good and bad. We know that leadership is important. Spiritual leaders have a role to play in trying to benefit society, and at the same time, maybe Macs aren't better because it's so small here I can barely read it, but you may have a better system with your printouts. Bhagavad Gita and other sacred texts from my tradition explains that we should try to learn the truth, understand our deeper selves by approaching a bona fide teacher or guru and inquire from them. So at least the principle is there. Spiritual teachers can render a lot of benefit for us. But the point of the panel here that we should not ignore or be ignorant of the potential for abuse. The media, we all know, you look in the papers, watch television, listen to radio, social media as well, full of exposés of various abuses of spiritual leaders, gurus, rabbis, priests, ministers, yogis, spiritual teachers of all sorts. And as Michael said, no one seems to be exempt, unfortunately. And the fact that spiritual leaders themselves are vulnerable to misusing power, to using their influence in such a way to avoid oversight. I'm a spiritual leader, don't check up on me. That's not allowed. Thinking I'm above reproach, and of course, potential for harming of others, which then harms the entire community, and oftentimes exploiting the resources in various ways of the communities. Too many stories we read about these events. And the old cartoon, we have met the enemy and he is us. As religious people, spiritual people, let's make sure we're not the source of the problem. As a lot of the panels have been talking about here at the Parliament, religion, that sometimes we see in the world today, religion itself is the source of the problem. So even in groups that aren't necessarily actively, visibly violent on a large scale, internally there may be so much harm going on a smaller scale, but still just as harmful to the individuals that are affected. So a little bit on our experience, the Hare Krishna Society. We have had some leaders and some gurus who thought themselves above the law and our own spiritual codes of conduct. Oftentimes, interestingly, those are the people that seem to have the most success, which kind of leads you to think, well, if you're doing so well, then maybe there is some special potency, spiritual power, purity that we just aren't really aware of. But it doesn't look like that, but maybe we're not quite sure. So we've had some of those issues. Leaders, as Michael said, may start out with all good intention, but we can become affected by the power that we're given or the strain of the position. He quoted an important phrase I'm going to try to remember: group-induced narcissism. Situationally induced narcissism. That's going to be next year's panel. We'll talk about that. But I thought that was quite a term. Misusing the philosophy, whatever it may be, in one's authority, and cutting off communities from the larger organization. And in our experience, we've had communities that separated themselves from the international organization and got into all kinds of issues about where does authority really lie? Does it lie with the individual head of a community, their international organization, and all kinds of problems there. Negative results: spiritual abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. We've had this problem. Breakdown in relationships with families, either within the religious community or certainly with families outside the community. Loss of faith in members. Again, we're kind of speaking in terms of world problem religions, what religious people, religious communities, religious leaders, or spiritual leaders need to be careful of. It leads to loss, nationally, faith in the members, and the entire system, the entire faith is lost because the abuse of, could just be one or two people. Loss of members as a result of that loss of faith. Damage to the organization's reputation can come. And we talked about, even in the Catholic Church, Legionnaires of Christ, oldest religious institution in the world, but major problems that at first they had a difficult time dealing with. In our situation, and often others, court cases result from this type of abuse, expelling people from the organization, excommunication, which is never a nice thing, but sometimes it has to be done, and years of healing that sometimes continues for decades. Part of this, in terms of looking at our particular case, it led to, I think it very much contributed to ISKCON being labeled a cult by some, Michael's group, the International Cultic Studies Association. We began a dialogue with what was in the American Family Foundation, feeling that we were wrongly labeled as a cult. But the first time I went and listened to some of their seminars, and they weren't talking about this is a good group or this is a bad group, most of them at least. Michael definitely wasn't. They were speaking about kind of a spectrum of leadership abuse and problems that can go wrong, and how healthy organizations are over here and unhealthy organizations over there, and that there's some room for some movement and definitely progress. So we recognize that we were vulnerable for these types of abuse of leaders, and that we had not just vulnerable, that had experienced a problem with that. And that in that sense, not only our members, but the community itself was victimized by abusive or cultic behavior, as Michael mentioned earlier, as can any organization, from the Marine Corps to the Boy Scouts to the Catholic Church, etc. So The benefits of dialogue that we found, being open to understanding the nature of these potential problems, allowed us to see the extent and the subtleties of the problem, and hopefully to kind of see things coming. That's hopefully the place we'd like to be too. You know what the warning signs are. To be able to proactively consider some solutions. And it wasn't entirely response to dialogue with ICSA and this paradigm of leadership abuse. There was some sense we need to mature and develop these systems anyway, but it very much helped us kind of give impetus to this. So we've developed ombud systems on an international level, mediation training, conflict resolution, there's established systems where people who are at that power disadvantage have a system by which they can talk to somebody and say, I think there's a problem here, where their identity is kept confidential and there's an opportunity for bringing problems to the surface. Also, I was very definitely influenced by the dialogue with ICSA. We may be the only organization in the world, it'd be an interesting study. I don't know if a lot of places have guru seminars. Before you can become a guru, you have to go through some specific training on not the spiritual philosophy and those things. Kind of understood, you ought to have that down by this time. But what are the potentials of abuse? What are the limits of your authority? What does it mean to the importance of maintaining peer association? What's the importance of working with a larger community and understanding that there's different levels of authority within communities, and how do you work in a peer methodology? And also awareness campaigns. We have international leadership meetings a couple of years ago, 1,100 people, and I did actually a PowerPoint presentation about 25 minutes, and kind of a typical rah-rah spiritual meeting. Let's go deeper in our faith and make the world a better place, and let's hold on everybody for just a minute. I'm here to talk about what can go wrong before we get too excited about what we're doing to make the world a better place. Let's make sure we're not contributing to the problems. So some of the things that we've tried to do. So quickly, what can communities and religious leaders do to protect ourselves and our societies? Some reflection of the points that Michael has made, but I think any repetition would probably be good on this one. First of all, know the warning signs, something that groups tend to not think about or talk about proactively, but I think it's very important. Some of those that abusive or potentially abusive leaders start thinking themselves above the law, above reports, you can't criticize me, declare themselves to have special and unique authority, which of course for religious communities, it's kind of part of the fabric. If you're a minister or a rabbi or a priest or a guru or yogi, you're supposed to have some kind of special something, or why is everybody coming to hear you on Sunday morning or Friday night? But what's the limits of that? That's the question. And not that it's a unique authority, but should be in line with some community standards, etc. The tendency to isolate themselves, we found this has been a big problem. When isolation steps in, nobody can say, excuse me, I think there's a problem here because that community has become isolated. Creation of us versus them types of mentalities, often us versus the world. When the group becomes a little separated, it becomes us versus the mainstream organization. And we're even better than the people who are better. Maybe the two of those turns into a negative automatically.
Yeah, right.
And of course the tendency to avoid being held accountable. As it is said, biblical teaching, pride cometh before the fall. No one can question my authority, part of the mentality that comes in. I am independent. I'm protected by God. So there may be some, don't question me too seriously because I'm on a special level. And such problems can happen to me. Even well-intended people may think it can happen to me. I know it's a dangerous situation, but it can happen to me. We all tend to think like that. And every time you find yourself going a few miles over the speed limit than you should, and you think, well, it won't happen to me. They're going to catch all those people that are speeding with ill intent. My reason is a good one. My reason is justified. It doesn't always work out that way. Healthy and proactive leaders welcome dialogue, debate, and dissent. Recognize the vulnerabilities of themselves and their communities. Look for and resolve problems proactively. Are open and honest about their own limitations. This can be a big challenge for a spiritual leader to be able to talk openly about my limitations. Shouldn't be. Humility is, as the Bhagavad Gita says, humility is the first quality of spiritual knowledge. So it should have the opposite. But if one's thinking, actually, I don't need to be open about my limitations, that in itself may be a problem or a warning sign. Proactive leaders on these issues are sensitive to what harmful behaviors are, watching out for those, humble, and we found this a key point, seeking peer support. We found in our organization, we've got people in spiritual leadership roles who are, in Nepal, and everyone, it may be 10 years their junior in age or spiritual practice, and just the natural kind of social dynamics, it's hard to have peer review in that kind of environment. But to ensure that, hey, well, okay, you're in Nepal and you're this senior spiritual leader. You got a buddy who's in Taiwan who's older than you who needs to call up and say, how you doing? Are you okay? Everything all right? And I noted seeing some issues or problems here. Humble and seeks peer support, as I said, and are transparent and welcome accountability. Proactive communities recognize that everyone is vulnerable, and that's so tough sometimes for religious communities. There's a tendency to think we really, because a lot of times religious people are trying to do things better. They are enthusiastic. They're trying to become respectful and more environmentally conscious and love people, as Jesus said, and become instruments of God's will, etc., according to their traditions. But recognize everybody is vulnerable for these kind of problems. Therefore, create systems of accountability and assessment. And don't become isolated. Careful to not allow themselves to become isolated. Encourage dialogue within and without. Know that leaders also need support. Get rid of the illusion from the beginning that the priest doesn't need help. He's not a human being. He's a priest. No, he's a human being first. Leaders need support. Address the problems with integrity. And as a general practice, ensure that we put members first and institutions second. That can be a very risky thing to do otherwise. And healthy leaders in communities listen to presentations like Michael and I have offered to you today and think, what should we do differently now? So, thank you very much. We do have a few minutes for questions.
Hi, I'm just grateful you all are doing this. I'm disappointed there's so few people in this room given this topic. I think, I've been involved with and watched like 20 different spiritual communities with varying levels of abuse, or not, or some coming up with good systems of checks. So I just really am feeling grateful that you're doing it and that you have the courage to represent an organization that's kind of gone through that developmental process. One other tool I use is Ken Wilber has what's called integral theory. And there's a lot of neat ideas in there that sort of help think through some of this, like lines of intelligence. Like somebody can maybe be strong on the charismatic line, but sucky on the ethical line. And we get confused because they're strong on the spiritual charismatic line and think that means they're morally great, and they're not necessarily.
Thank you.
Right.
Any other questions, comments?
Can you just say again what was the what does that stand for? ICSA, whatever the IK.
International Cultic Studies Association.
Okay, thank you.
Your website is icsahome.com. I think your hand's up first.
With so many masters, Master Jesus being anti-establishment, and so many other masters being anti-establishment, I just wonder where, because now any establishment would have that some non-balance, and so I just wonder if it's hopeless to be in a spiritual community, because our masters are telling us that the truth is in us and that there's no need to have a guru outside of us. And if already the balance is going to be, and I'm coming from a spiritual community that was abusive, and that's why I'm asking.
Can you phrase the question more precisely? I'm not sure what you're asking.
Is it possible to have an organization without abuse?
Yeah. I mean, it can happen. It's to me, if you look at the statistics like child abuse, parent-child is the prototypical power imbalance. Most families are not abusive. And even among new religious movements, I don't think abuse is necessarily the norm. We don't really have good data because there are literally thousands of groups. And organizations change. So I don't think it's hopeless. And I think the work that Anuttama and other people in ISKCON have done shows that organizations can change in a positive way. So, you know, perhaps your group may be hopeless because a lot depends upon the leadership and how open they are to change. But I don't think it's a generalization that you could say that all groups are hopeless.
My group actually became abusive once the guru passed away, who was my dad.
Ma'am, you had a question?
I was going to say that where you have a model that's presented like that, it seems to me that to some, as she articulated, that to some extent that's a red flag in itself, and we should be looking at it. And it's true that on the one hand we look to our spiritual experience or transformation, but it also seems to me, and this is something that our community is working with, our congregation is working with, that you need to see this kind of very close involvement and proactive measures in order to prevent abuse as being part of the very spirituality that we're trying to cultivate. It's inherent, it's intrinsic to that. And if you don't have that kind of view coming from your leadership or from the community, maybe you ought to be looking a lot closer.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. And I think most religions value humility, but unfortunately, not as many religious professionals practice humility as they should. And it's that pride, as Anuttama said, pride cometh before the fall. Pride is, in a sense, the impetus for the self-deception that enables leaders to abuse those who are under them.
Next question. The man just held up the sign saying, "Please end." So maybe we can take one more question.
Yeah. Yeah, she was first.
Just in my experience with religious communities, I know that there's definitely power dynamics that are at play that can create abuse, and that can also lead to self-abuse, like self-harm, addiction, stuff like that. So in an institution that in theory should stand for justice and interpersonal reconciliation, how do you address people that are struggling internally?
Well, my sense is that spiritual practice is there of all different varieties to help all of us address the inner struggle we're having. My tradition teaches we're spiritual in the material world, so it's automatically oil and water. There's conflict here, there's problems here. And when we try to address those through some type of spiritual practice, we bring whatever baggage we have with us. You know, we're all works in progress, including our leadership. So I think the main thing is the idea being that some people may, through their practice, through their particular personal abilities and you know, we would say spiritual advancement over some time, may be more adept in helping others, leading others, but we're all, as I mentioned multiple times, you know, we're all vulnerable. And if we keep that sense that we're all vulnerable, and at the same time our spiritual practice, our religious faith is meant to help us kind of overcome that. But when it becomes the only thing, then it becomes particularly potentially harmful, I think.
Yeah, since I'm a psychologist, you know, I would say a lot of people who have been victims of abuse in groups will suffer the consequences sometimes many years after they leave the group. It sort of resonates within them, it echoes within them, because they don't really understand, particularly if they were in a group where they were indoctrinated to think that everything that went wrong was their fault, because the group and the leadership is, you know, they're perfect, they can't be wrong. And getting some psychological, some counseling help can be helpful. And I suggest that you people consider it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you all very much. Appreciate you.